This is Dr. Gary Kellner, and I would like to welcome you to Fair Game. Around the 8th of May every year, I think of Harry Truman, the last president to serve in the White House without having gone to college. Harry Truman reminds me about why we go into public life. It was my privilege to serve as a school board member when I lived in Springfield, Missouri. I knew people who knew President Truman. In fact, I had a secretary whose parents grew up with him in the First Presbyterian Church in Independence. And when she would be on her way to school every morning, she would pass him as he did his morning constitutional. And he would look at her and go, "Hello, Marlene. How are you? How's mom? How's dad? How are the grandparents?" Same speech 180 days a year. But it made a 9-year-old girl feel special. My daughter had a teacher who wore a red coat to a Labor Day parade when President Truman came to Springfield. And he got out of the car, walked over to the little girl and said, "I really like that coat. I think I'd like to take it home and wear it myself." And the little girl rather spiritedly argued with the President of the United States. That wonderful human touch, his love for the people he served, his commitment to doing the absolute best job he could, to me, make Harry Truman one of the most significant presidents of the modern era. Now, that doesn't mean that he lived without tension. When Harry Truman was county judge in Jackson County, Pendergast boys were stealing money hand over fist. And Harry periodically would check into the Blackstone Hotel in Kansas City with a fifth of whiskey and a writing pad, and he would write letters to himself. More than once, Truman said, "I don't know whether I am serving the public good or I'm just another crook." Like all of us, he gets pushed into situations and he gets pushed into decisions where he has second thoughts. But Harry Truman always tried to do the right thing. Which brings me to the most controversial decision of his presidency, dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. America had settled the war in Europe, shifted its full attention to defeating the Empire of Japan. They were going to invade the home islands in 1946. Most of the Pentagon leadership believed it would result in 1 million casualties. That would translate to at least 100,000 dead. But Truman knew that the Empire of Japan had to be defeated. They had ruthlessly and brutally invaded China. They killed 350,000 people in a few days in Nanking, China. And Truman just wasn't going to have it. Well, his generals told him that we could drop the bomb on Hiroshima and that it probably would kill 100,000 people, but our firebombing had done that. Most important, it would send a message to the emperor that couldn't possibly win, and the next target might in fact be Tokyo. Truman himself never felt a moment of conflict over that decision. When it came to a choice between letting the Empire of Japan continue or saving American lives, he made the choice to save American lives. I'll never forget, I went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio one time, where the Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the bomb, was in the museum. My dad had already gotten his orders to go to the Pacific. And when we got to the Enola Gay, my dad's eyes brimmed with tears. Took a handkerchief out of his back pocket like a lot of the fathers of my era carried. And he wiped his eyes. And he said, "You know, boy, if it weren't for Harry, you might not be here." There was a debt of gratitude. There are people who criticize Truman for the decision, and any presidential decision is subject to review and it's subject to conversation. But what I find so interesting is none of the people close to Truman ever had any second thoughts about that one. Harry Truman was committed to doing the right thing as he saw the right. He knew he wasn't correct 100% of the time, but he tried. Which brings us to his second big controversial decision. It's when he fired five-star General Douglas MacArthur, who was one of the great heroes of World War II. And when North Korea invaded the South, MacArthur came up with a dramatic and risky strategy, not to slog his way up the Korean peninsula, but to stage an amphibious landing at Incheon and get behind them. Well, it worked. Well, MacArthur was, as Truman referred to him, General Four-Star Brass Hat MacArthur. Sometimes he called him God MacArthur. He couldn't stand him. Partly because MacArthur got confused about who the boss was. And he would leak things to the press and he would give interviews that were highly critical of the commander-in-chief. Truman was frustrated with him, met him at Wake Island. MacArthur promised to do better. He didn't. Finally, General George Marshall, who was the Secretary of Defense, was called into the White House, and the president asked him to read all the correspondence between him and General MacArthur. General Marshall came back the next day and in colorful Army language that I will let you fill in the blanks on, said, "I would have fired him 18 months ago." Truman knew they'd very likely cost him a second term to fire Douglas MacArthur. But he believed in the Constitution. He believed that the military had to be subordinate to the civilian officials, and he did it. I would say that through much of my life, Harry Truman has been one of my great inspirations. And when I'm faced with a tough decision, I try to ask myself a question: what would Harry do? That if we respect the people who elect us, if we do our best to do our duty, most of the time things will come out pretty well. Well, that would be true in a family, wouldn't it? And in a business, and in the community. President Truman faced some of the most difficult decisions of the modern presidency. Not only did he have to decide whether to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, he had to decide whether he was going to recognize Israel as an independent nation. Now, 80 years later, that might not seem like a very difficult decision to us, but here's the problem. Our allies were the Saudis. And at the end of the Second World War, the British were bankrupt. They could not provide security for the Middle East. They could not protect the oil fields from the Russians. And America had to step in and assume that role. Well, to make it work, you're going to have to get along with the locals, none of whom want a state of Israel. Well, in May of 1948, it is absolutely clear that the Jews are going to announce their independence. The entire State Department is against it. The Middle East office of the State Department was especially vocal. At this time, the Secretary of State was one of the greatest Americans in our history, General George Marshall, who had been Chief of Staff during the Second War. Now he was the Secretary of State. General Marshall was thoughtful, measured, strategic. Harry Truman said General Marshall was the best man I ever knew. General Marshall advised President Truman not to recognize Israel. But from the time Truman was a teenager, when he started reading the Bible every day, which is something he did his entire 88 years, he had read the story of Cyrus, who sent the exiled Jews back to their homeland and gave them the chance to flower again, to prosper again. And there was something about that story that just resonated with Harry Truman. So he decided that he would recognize Israel. He knew how strongly General Marshall felt. It was quite possible General Marshall would resign. That absolutely would have cost Truman the fall election. But when Harry Truman felt he should do something, he wasn't going to worry too much about the outcome of an election. So he recognized Israel. Just a few days later, he recognized Israel moments after they declared their independence on May 14, 1948. Barely 10 days later, the president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, came to Truman's office to thank him for what he had done and to present him with a set of Torah scrolls as an expression of the appreciation of the Jewish people globally. When Weizmann presented the Torah scrolls to Truman, he began to weep. Because Weizmann looked at him and he said, "Mr. President, you are Cyrus." And when Truman composed himself, he said, "I am. I have long felt that this would be part of my mission." There is a moral dimension to leadership, whether it's in a family, a business, a community, an HOA, that often gets ignored. In our culture, we tend to reduce leadership to a technology, to a set of skills, to a set of behavior. At its core, leadership is about a moral vision of life in this world. And at every point in his presidency, when Harry Truman was faced with a decision about the fate of humanity, he always came down on the moral side of the question. And this is why I believe that if we add anybody to Mount Rushmore, we should think about adding the little man from Independence. This is Dr. Gary Kellner, and this is Fair Game.